Picture the very first morning. The sirens have finally stopped screaming. The fires on the horizon have dimmed to gray smoke. You wake up expecting chaos, expecting to hear the panic of the world outside. But instead, you are greeted by something far more terrifying. Absolute heavy silence. The hum of the refrigerator is gone. The distant drone of traffic on the highway has vanished. There is no internet signal, no dial tone, no news broadcast. We expect the apocalypse to be a cacophony of noise. But the reality of the first morning after a global war would be something far more unsettling. It would not be cinematic. It would be quiet. A strange, heavy silence would settle over the world. A quiet that does not belong to peace, but to shock. In many cities, the skyline would remain unchanged. The buildings would still be standing. The streets would still exist. You would still wake up. But the world you woke up to would be fundamentally completely different. Not because of what is there, but because of what is suddenly missing. The terror isn't in the explosions. It is in the cessation of the hum. The invisible threads that we have relied on for 80 years without a second thought. The power grids, the water pumping stations, the complex food distribution networks would be fractured or gone entirely. We often make the mistake of thinking civilization is destroyed by blast waves. It isn't. It is undone by the snapping of these invisible connections that hold the system together. The phones would fail. The governments would be silent. The sirens would stop, and the missiles would cease falling. But the world does not end. Instead, it simply changes permanently. The silence that follows is not a pause. It is the sound of the machinery of modern life grinding to a halt, leaving us to answer a question we have never had to ask. What are we without the noise that once sustained us? We grew up looking at Mercator maps, where the sheer size of a nation equated to its strength. We assumed that the larger the color on the map, the more resilient the country. But in the aftermath of a global system collapse, size is no longer an asset. It is a liability. The very complexity that makes a superpower dominant in peace becomes its undoing in silence. The countries least touched by the blasts themselves would still feel the collapse intimately. Large nations with diverse regions, the United States, Russia, China, India, would find their internal unity tested far more than their external defenses. The threat isn't invasion, it is fragmentation. Consider the United States. It would not disappear, but the concept of federal power would weaken significantly. A government in Washington cannot manage a crisis in Oregon when the invisible threads of communication and transport are severed. Instead, state and regional governments would take the lead out of pure necessity. We would see borders emerging inside our borders. The fracture lines would be economic and geographic. Coastal megacities, densely packed and reliant on imported food, would struggle immediately. In contrast, the interior regions, the Midwest, the places with farmland, railroads, and fresh water, would become the new centers of gravity. The flyover states would suddenly become the only states that function. Russia faces a different version of this same trap, the tyranny of distance. Its vast landmass requires immense amounts of energy and fuel just to function as a single entity. Without that constant injection of resources, the center cannot hold the periphery. Russia would contract, not because of an enemy army, but because regions like Siberia and the Far East would simply drift away from Moscow's influence. Local leaders and military governors would emerge to manage survival, creating a patchwork of territories rather than a unified motherland. China's challenge is perhaps the most daunting. Its survival has always depended on movement: goods, fuel, cargo, and ships. If trade stops, that immense population transforms from an economic engine into a burden the state must struggle to control. While rural provinces might stabilize themselves through subsistence, the coastal cities could empty as the government races to distribute food faster than panic spreads. Interestingly, it is the nations we often overlook that might fare the best. Countries like Japan, Switzerland, Finland, and Singapore, small, highly organized, and accustomed to emergency planning, would have the greatest chance of stabilizing quickly. They do not suffer from the bloat of distance. Their discipline and order allow them to pivot, whereas the giants are too heavy to turn. Ultimately, the first governments to fail will be those built on centralized authority. Systems that require instant communication and total obedience cannot survive alive when the line goes dead. A country the size of a continent cannot be managed in silence. In this new world, authority returns to the scale of human trust, and the map is redrawn not by treaties, but by the practical limits of how far a leader can shout. In the quiet that follows the collapse, the first casualty is politics. For generations, we have lived in a world defined by high-minded treaties, complex trade agreements, and the grand theater of international relations. But after a global war, international organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and economic alliances would lose relevance quickly. They wouldn't dissolve because their missions failed. They would fade away simply because nations no longer have the capacity to participate. When the phone lines are dead and the fuel tanks are dry, the global stage vanishes. Cooperation shrinks immediately to the regional level. The new reality is stark. Alliances return to geography, not ideology. This brings us to a fundamental shift in human governance. We are used to leaders who depend on control, on the ability to command and expect instant obedience. But systems that require instant communication cannot survive when communication itself collapses. Leaders who try to rule through the old methods of centralized control will lose their grip within hours, not because they are weak, but because no one can govern a population waiting for answers that cannot be given. In this vacuum, a simple, brutal truth emerges. Control is not power. Stability is. The most functional governments will be the ones that understand this distinction immediately. We will see the rise of local authority as the primary structure of survival. Mayors, governors, military base commanders, community organizers, anyone with a clear plan and access to resources becomes the government by default. This is the end of the political spectrum as we know it. The debates between left and right, Democrat and Republican, dissolve into the air. Ideology no longer matters. Logistics does. People will follow the person who can keep the water flowing and the food available. In some areas, this means the military becomes the stabilizing institution. In others, religious organizations or tribal networks take over. The specific shape varies by culture, but the pattern is universal. Authority returns to the scale of human trust. Over time, this coalesces into a new form of governance, resource rule. Power will no longer be derived from speeches, elections, or constitutional mandates. It will come from the physical control of water, farmland, medical supplies, transportation hubs, and energy sources. Leaders will be judged by a single, terrifying metric. Is life under them possible? This does not necessarily mean chaos. In many places, a quiet, disciplined order will emerge. But we must be clear about what this is. It is an order built on rationing, coordination, and necessity, not law or constitution. The social contract simplifies into something direct and binding. We survive together, or we do not survive at all. It is a strange stability, not the stability of peace, but the stability of adaptation. We have spent the last few decades building a world that lives in the cloud. We trade stocks in microseconds. We communicate instantly across oceans, and we assume that money is nothing more than a number on a screen. But when the systems stop, the world does not return to the familiar rhythms of commerce and convenience. Instead, the global economy, once driven by constant movement, by ships crossing oceans and flights linking continents, collapses into something older, slower, and undeniably physical. The most jarring change will be the silence of our machines. It starts in small ways. The light switch that no longer responds, the internet page that refuses to load. Our refrigerators become nothing more than silent, insulated boxes, and the smartphone, that device we currently view as a portal to the entire universe, is instantly reduced to a simple flashlight. Technology does not disappear, it simply sleeps. Servers gather. Dust, solar panels sit idle, and abandoned factories remain like the bones of a giant creature that no longer breathes. In this new reality, the currency of ordinary life shifts from money to usefulness. Banks will close not because they have been destroyed, but because the currency they hold has lost its meaning. A dollar, a euro, or a yen is a promise, a symbol that assumes a functioning system stands behind it. When that system stops, the symbol evaporates. Value returns to what can be held, exchanged, or consumed. Suddenly, the wealthiest man in the neighborhood is not the one with the largest pension fund, but the one with a stockpile of batteries, clean water filters, and seeds. Food becomes currency. Fuel becomes currency. Medicine and warm clothing become the new gold standard. Without a working grid, every action requires a return to physical effort. Cooking is no longer a button press. It demands fire. Heating a home demands wood. Travel is no longer a matter of gas pedals, but of walking. As a result, the world becomes bigger again, measured once more by the distance the human body can cover in a day. This shift forces a profound transformation in how we view work and education. The modern world's greatest divide, the separation between thinking and making, disappears entirely. The abstract professional, the consultant, the digital marketer, these roles vanish. In their place, skills once dismissed as hobbies become essential. Gardening, repair work, first aid, and carpentry are no longer pastimes. They are the prerequisites for seeing the next winter. Education and work merge into a single sphere. Children will not learn from tablets. They will learn by doing. Survival becomes the curriculum. Knowledge returns to its oldest form. Skills passed by hand from one generation to the next. It is a brutal adjustment, but it strips away the illusion of invincibility. We are forced to remember what matters when everything else is stripped away. We return to a life where we are judged not by what we own in a database, but by what we can build, fix, and grow with our own hands. The collapse of the global order will not be felt evenly. In urban areas, scarcity arrives with terrifying speed. Our modern cities are not self-sufficient organisms. They are systems built on constant delivery, requiring a ceaseless flow of trucks, ships, and fuel to function. When those arteries are cut, shelves empty in days, not weeks. The result is a forced migration. Crowds will move, some leaving in desperation, others remaining to adapt to a concrete landscape that no longer provides for them. But out in the countryside, the rhythm is different. Life slows down, yet it stabilizes. This is where the fortress farm emerges. We are not talking about a military bunker, but an economic one. Farms transform into fortresses of value, and quiet rural towns evolve into the new centers of trade, barter, and community rule. In a world without electronic banking, a plot of fertile soil is more valuable than a vault of gold. However, there is a harsh lesson that will be learned quickly. The myth of the lone wolf survivor is just that, a myth. For years, the popular image of survival has been the solitary man, armed and isolated, protecting his stockpile against the world. But in reality, those who isolate will not last. The demands of a manual existence, security, agriculture, gathering water, maintenance, are too great for one individual or even one family. Communities form around necessity. People who never spoke to their neighbors in the time of plenty will begin to share meals, tools, and watch shifts. Division, once a matter of ideology or politics, becomes strictly practical. The question is no longer, who did you vote for? But, can you repair a generator? Or, do you know how to treat a wound? Those who cooperate survive longer than those who try to go it alone. This rewrites the social contract into something direct and unbreakable. The complex laws of the old world are replaced by a simple understanding. We survive together, or we do not survive at all. Shared hardship creates a unity that prosperity never could. The fortress farm is not defended by high walls alone, but by the trust between the people inside them. Ultimately, after the collapse of the global economy, what remains is not wealth in the traditional sense. What remains is connection, the oldest economy humans have ever known. It is a return to a time when your word was your bond, not because of honor, but because your neighbor's survival depended on it, and yours depended on them. The world that rises from the ashes is not a return to the past. It is something entirely new, built from memory, loss, and necessity. The map eventually hardens once more, but the new borders are not drawn by political political aspiration. They are drawn along natural lines, rivers, mountains, and fertile valleys. In this future, empire becomes impossible simply because distance is too costly to maintain. We stop looking outward and start looking inward. The infrastructure of the old world remains like the bones of a giant creature that no longer breathes. In time, some of it is revived, but not in the pursuit of grand skyscrapers or limitless markets. The focus shifts to restoration rather than expansion. Culture deepens in ways the pre-war world rarely allowed. Art changes tone. It becomes simpler, truer, and closer to the daily struggle of life. History is no longer taught in books alone, but in the landscapes that bear the scars of the collapse. A new generation grows up who did not see the old world of excess, and they do not miss it. Eventually the world reconnects, but it does so cautiously. Sailboats cross the seas before cargo ships do. A new global order emerges, but it is decentralized and built on mutual necessity rather than dominance. Humanity learns a lesson, however imperfectly. We realize that survival is not guaranteed by strength, but by stability, cooperation, and restraint. The illusion of invincibility is gone, and with it, the arrogance of endless growth. What remains is something quieter and more deliberate, a world learning to live within its limits. It is a world that continues forward not because it must, but because life always finds a way to begin again.